Some mysteries linger not in the present, but in the echoes of years long past. It begins with a faded letter, dated 1893, its ink trembling with secrets that refuse to stay buried, and a family's vengeance bound to the shadow of Moriarty. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. Now, let us step once more into Baker Street, where the ghosts of the past wait to be unmasked. It was on one of those nights when London seemed to drown beneath its own melancholy that the matter first came before us. The rain fell in unrelenting sheets, each drop rattling upon the window panes of Baker Street like the tapping of 1,000 restless fingers. The lamps outside were but faint halos in the fog, their lights swallowed by the darkness that pressed against the glass. Within, however, our rooms glowed with a modest fire, and Holmes sat opposite me, long limbs folded like some watchful heron, his eyes reflecting the flames though his mind was already leagues beyond them. I remember remarking upon the dreariness of the hour, for I fancied no client would seek us in such weather. Holmes only smiled faintly, the bow of his violin poised in his hand. "The night itself conspires to cloak secrets, Watson," he murmured, and at that moment the silence of the street was broken by a knock so sudden, so hollow, that it seemed almost spectral. The sound reverberated through the hall, muffled by the storm outside. Mrs. Hudson's step was heard upon the stair, followed by the slow creak of the door. Into our chamber stepped a woman, her countenance as pale as alabaster, her garments sodden and clinging to her slight frame. She clutched a bundle close against her chest, as though the contents were both precious and perilous. Holmes set aside his violin at once. "You are most welcome here, madam," he said, with that peculiar mixture of courtesy and authority which few could resist. "Pray, take the chair nearest the fire. You have braved a night that would drive most men to shelter." Her lips trembled as she obeyed. I could see her hands shaking, not from the cold alone, but from some deep agitation. The bundle she carried was bound in faded ribbon, as though it had long lain hidden, only to be torn from its resting place by some desperate urgency. When she spoke, her voice faltered. "Mr. Holmes, it is a matter of life and death. My brother, he is dead, and with him was found this." From the bundle she drew forth a single letter. Its paper was yellowed, its edges brittle with age, as though it had been penned not yesterday, but years ago. With trembling fingers she placed it upon Holmes's desk. I leaned forward to examine it, and felt a chill pass through me. Upon the outer fold, written in a bold but wavering hand, was my companion's own name, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Holmes's eyes, sharp as hawk's talons, fixed upon the script. He bent low, his long fingers brushing the paper with reverence, as though it were some relic unearthed from a tomb. The date inscribed at the top was unmistakable, the year 1893. The very year in which Holmes had vanished from the world at the Reichenbach, mourned as dead until his sudden return years later. The woman's voice, scarcely above a whisper, broke the silence. "This letter was found by my brother's body. He was murdered, Mr. Holmes, and before his death he spoke of a hand that reached from the past to destroy him. I beg of you, tell me what this means." Holmes lifted his gaze, and for the briefest moment his iron composure wavered. His lips moved as though shaping words too dreadful to speak aloud. At last he leaned closer to me, his voice no more than a breath against the storm outside. "This hand," he murmured, eyes fixed upon the faded script. "I have seen it before, long ago." Her hands clutched the chair arms as though to anchor herself against the weight of memory. "My brother," she whispered, "was struck down in the dead of night. They found him in the alleyway behind our home, his throat marked with violence no honest thief would dare commit. Yet at his side, preserved as though placed with deliberate care, lay this letter you now hold." I leaned forward, compelled despite myself by the tremor in her voice. "And you are certain," I asked gently, "that he carried no such paper before that night?" She shook her head. I had never seen it in his possession. It bore no message addressed to him, No explanation for its presence. Only your name, Mr. Holmes, inscribed as if fate itself had written it upon the day of his death. Holmes regarded her closely, every line of her expression subjected to his merciless scrutiny. Your brother, he said at last, died not by chance, but by intention. Whoever struck him down wished this relic to be found. And by ensuring it was discovered, they summoned me, as surely as if they had rung the bell of Baker Street themselves. His words hung in the air like smoke curling from a lamp, and for the first time that evening, I felt a chill crawl along my spine. It was as though some phantom hand from the grave had reached across the decades to beckon Holmes into a snare woven long ago. Holmes spread the letter before him, tilting it toward the firelight. His keen eyes darted across each faded line, his brow knitting into the faintest furrow of concern. He traced the strokes of the pen with a fingertip, lingering at certain curves and flourishes, as though the hand itself whispered to him from beyond the grave. I knew that look, the silent communion between Holmes and a piece of evidence, as though the object ceased to be inanimate, and instead spoke in a language only he could decipher. Yet on this occasion, I perceived something more. A hesitation, a tightening at the corners of his mouth, the faintest tremor of unease. This is no common hand, he said quietly, nor the idle scrawl of an imitator. There lies beneath these letters a discipline, the mark of a man who sought to disguise his nature while unable entirely to escape it. See here, Watson. The downward stroke betrays haste, the flourish conceals a violence barely contained. This is the writing of one who wished to vanish, yet leave his presence stamped upon the page. His voice had grown colder with each word, and though I longed to press him for more, I knew better than to interrupt his meditation. The fire cracked, the storm rattled against the panes, and still he bent over the paper, lips drawn thin, as though staring into a mirror of some old and terrible acquaintance. The silence in the room grew oppressive, broken only by the steady rhythm of the storm outside. The woman sat rigid in her chair, her eyes darting between Holmes's face and the letter that seemed to hold him captive. For my part, I could scarcely endure the stillness. I longed for him to speak, to pierce the oppressive fog that settled upon us all. At length, Holmes lifted his head. His eyes, sharp and grey, met mine with a look that sent a shiver to my very marrow. He leaned closer, his voice so low I scarce caught it above the fire's whisper. "This hand," he murmured. "I have seen it before, long ago." He said no more, yet the words fell upon me with the weight of prophecy. Somewhere in the labyrinth of 1893, that dark year of his supposed death, lay the origin of this letter, and perhaps the shadow of a foe long thought vanquished. The woman gave a faint cry, muffling it with her hand, but Holmes neither comforted nor dismissed her. His gaze remained upon the page, unblinking, as though the ink itself might at any moment shift and reveal the face of the phantom who had summoned him back into the abyss of his past. The following morning found Holmes in a mood of grave industry. He had drawn forth from his private cabinet a set of worn, leather-bound notebooks whose edges were frayed and whose pages carried the faint odour of dust and time. These volumes, long untouched, belonged to that sinister interlude of his life when he had vanished from the eyes of England, thought by all, myself included, to have perished at Reichenbach Falls. Holmes turned the brittle leaves with careful precision, his gaze darting swiftly from one cryptic notation to another. Strange symbols, coded references, and abbreviated names filled the margins. I knew better than to disturb him, for his entire being was bent upon tracing some forgotten thread that had escaped the web of justice so many years ago. At last he spoke, his voice low and measured. "You perceive, Watson, that these are not mere records of survival. They are the chronicles of a war, the remnants of an unfinished battle. In 1893, I struck down the Hydra's head, but I did not burn the body. What we face now is the reawakening of those severed limbs." The words, uttered with his peculiar calmness, chilled me more than any storm of the previous night. For if Holmes, who had conquered Moriarty himself, now admitted to unfinished work, then surely the danger was greater than any we had yet encountered. Holmes continued his examination until his finger paused upon a list inked in his own sharp hand. He tapped lightly upon several names, each one a relic of the past. Moran, Bexley, Underwood. Some were marked as captured, others as executed, and a few, ominously, left without notation. "Do you recognize them, Watson?" he asked, without lifting his eyes from the page. I did, all too well. Colonel Moran, the last and most dangerous lieutenant of Moriarty's army. Others I recalled only dimly, faces glimpsed in trials, whispers in courtrooms, reports buried in newspapers. Yet to see them arrayed here, conjured as if summoned by some necromancer, was to feel once more the oppressive weight of those days when London had trembled beneath the professor's reign. Holmes leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. It is an error of the human mind to believe that death alone banishes fear. These names are not corpses in the ground, they are phantoms who return when summoned. And someone has done the summoning. The murder of this woman's brother, the letter dated in the year of my supposed death. It is no coincidence. It is a signal, Watson, that the ghosts of 1893 are abroad once more. I confess that his words carried me back to those dreadful months when I had believed my friend lost forever, and the sensation was so vivid that I felt as though the walls of Baker Street themselves trembled with memory. Holmes rose and walked to the window, drawing aside the curtain with a swift, decisive hand. Outside, the street was alive with the ordinary commerce of London, the hansom cabs rattling over cobblestones, the hawkers crying their wares, the endless tide of humanity flowing past. Yet Holmes's gaze pierced deeper, as though he discerned beneath the mundane exterior a darker current. "You observe the milkman across the way, Watson, and the boy loitering beside the lamp-post. To your eye they are but common figures. To mine they are possibilities, watchers who blend with the crowd, invisible until the moment they strike." I followed his gaze, but saw nothing unusual. Still, the intensity of his manner filled me with unease. "Moriarty's empire," he continued, "was never wholly destroyed. It merely receded, like a tide drawing back from the shore. What I perceive now is its slow return. These remnants, scattered, leaderless, but not extinguished, have waited for their moment, and it appears that moment is upon us." His words cast a shadow over the familiar street, transforming its every face into a potential mask of hostility. I shivered as I considered the possibility that, even as we sat in the seeming safety of Baker Street, eyes watched us from beyond the glass, reporting our every motion to some hidden master. Holmes let the curtain fall and returned to his chair, his expression grave. "We are not merely pursuing a murder, Watson. We are being drawn into a design laid long ago, one that began in 1893 and has not yet finished its work." It was but 2 days after the woman's visit that grim tidings reached us. A messenger, breathless and pale, brought word of another assault, one not far from the wharves of the Thames. The victim, unlike her brother, had survived, though grievously shaken. Holmes received the account with unnerving composure, but I could see his fingers drum upon the arm of his chair, the sole betrayal of the storm that brewed within his mind. "Watson," he said curtly, "the noose is tightening. This second blow is meant not merely to terrify but to draw attention, and the name that was spoken leaves no doubt as to the hand behind it. We made our way through the dense London fog to the place of the attack. The lamps glowed faintly, swallowed by the mist. Shapes loomed and vanished like phantoms. It required little imagination to see in every shadow the presence of an assassin. The surviving victim, a man of middling years, had been waylaid upon his return from the docks. With a suddenness that stunned him, a figure had leapt from the gloom, striking with a ferocity born not of theft, but of hatred. Yet the most chilling detail was his testimony. In the heat of the struggle, his assailant had hissed my companion's name with venomous fury. "Sherlock Holmes," he had whispered, "your turn is coming." At this revelation, I felt a cold weight settle upon me, for it was no longer a crime that brushed against Holmes's life. It was a crime that had begun to weave its net directly about him. Holmes and I attended the man at his lodgings, where he lay upon his bed, bandaged and trembling. His eyes darted to the corners of the room, as though the very shadows conspired against him. Holmes seated himself at the bedside, his manner calm, precise, almost surgical in its detachment. "Describe your attacker," Holmes said softly. The man swallowed hard. He was tall, or so I thought. The fog made all uncertain. His coat was long, his hat low, but it was the voice, sir. I swear it was not a living man's voice, but one dragged up from the grave, cold, rasping. And when he spoke your name, I felt as though death itself had taken hold of me. The testimony sent a shiver down my spine. A ghostly return of Moriarty, a shade from 1893 walking again in the fog. The notion, absurd as it was, held a dreadful fascination. Yet Holmes remained unmoved. He leaned closer, his keen eyes narrowing. "You noted no accent, no peculiarities of gait. Think carefully. A man may disguise his face, even his clothing, but rarely his manner of movement." The man hesitated. "There was, yes, a limp, slight but marked. The right leg, I believe." Holmes's lips curved into the faintest smile, though his eyes remained hard. "Just so. Ghosts, my dear Watson, do not limp." The words, though rational, did little to ease my disquiet. For if it was no spectre, then it was a man of flesh and blood, deliberately invoking the shadows of 1893 to cloak his crime in terror. That night, long after the city had sunk into uneasy slumber, Holmes remained at his desk, the letter of 1893 spread before him once more. The lamp burned low, casting its circle of light upon the faded ink. I watched from my chair, weary yet unwilling to abandon him to his vigil. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the occasional scratch of Holmes's pencil as he traced curious patterns upon his notepaper. At last, he leaned back, eyes glinting with triumph. "Watson," he said, his voice vibrant with discovery, "observe here, the spacing of the words, the irregularity of certain letters. They are not mere accidents of a trembling hand. They form a code, artfully concealed, yet unmistakable to one who knows the methods of Moriarty's circle." I bent forward, and he demonstrated with swift precision how every third letter spelled a message hidden in plain sight. The words, when revealed, struck me with a chill greater than any winter storm. Reichenbach. Holmes folded the paper with deliberate care, his expression unreadable. "The cipher leaves us no doubt, Watson. Whoever pens these threats, whoever strikes these blows, wishes to summon me back to the place of my supposed death. Reichenbach Falls is not yet finished with me, nor I with it." He spoke with quiet finality, and I knew as surely as I had known the first time I watched him vanish into those dreadful Swiss waters, that our path had now turned irrevocably toward that haunted abyss. The following day, I found Holmes seated at his desk, the mysterious letter spread wide before him. Around him lay an array of documents, old trial transcripts, scraps of correspondence seized from Moriarty's network, and several yellowing dossiers I had not seen since those dreadful months that preceded his disappearance. Holmes bent over the papers with an intensity that drew the very air taut around him. His magnifying lens glinted in the morning light as he traced the flourishes of the ink, pausing often to compare one specimen to another. His movements were precise, economical, and yet I detected beneath his composure the faintest tremor of unease. "You see, Watson," he said at last, gesturing for me to observe, "this hand strives for anonymity, but cannot fully disguise its nature. Note the hesitation before the downward stroke of the H, the forced symmetry in the loops of the S. They are the marks of one who has long practiced concealment. Yet habit is the prison of every man, and even the careful cannot escape it. I peered at the documents, but confessed myself unable to distinguish the peculiarities he described. Holmes, however, pressed on with the cold authority of a surgeon cutting into hidden flesh. This is not the writing of a stranger. It belongs to a circle already known to us, and more ominously, to one who still walks among the living. His words filled me with a sense of dread, as though the past, long thought buried, had only lain in wait, whispering through the inked strokes that spanned the gulf between 1893 and our present hour. Holmes rose from his chair and paced the room, his long fingers clasped behind his back. There is one name, Watson, that emerges from this inquiry, like a serpent from its coil. A man who presided over Moriarty's trials, whose hand is not often found upon criminal documents, yet whose acquaintance with the professor's allies was closer than ever reached the public ear. I started at his words. "Surely you do not mean—" "Judge Horace Felden," Holmes declared with quiet finality. A pillar of respectability, a man lauded for his impartiality. And yet, he pointed to a set of notations within the files. "See here. His personal correspondence was once intercepted, carrying peculiar similarities of stroke to our present letter. The disguise is evident, but the shadow of his style remains. More damning still, he had opportunity. He vanished for days during the height of the Moriarty affair, claiming illness, an absence never wholly accounted for. I confess my heart sank. To suspect a judge, one entrusted with the scales of justice, seemed to cast a darkness upon the very foundation of our society." Yet Holmes's calm certainty left little room for comfort. Respectability, Watson, is often the mask behind which the most insidious criminals conceal themselves, Holmes remarked. The greater the man's public virtue, the deeper his private stain may be. We must tread carefully, for to accuse him without certainty is to shake the faith of the people in the very courts that govern them. The thought chilled me, for if such a man stood complicit, then corruption had indeed seeped into the highest ranks of law and order, making our pursuit not only perilous, but profoundly unsettling. Even as Holmes pursued his deductions, the streets of London seemed to echo with whispers. Reports reached us through Inspector Lestrade that among the rougher quarters of the city, tales had spread of Moriarty himself. Risen from the grave, returned to avenge his shattered empire. I dismissed these rumours as the natural superstitions of frightened men, yet their persistence carried a power more corrosive than fact. The cabman muttered of a figure glimpsed in fog-laden alleys. Dock workers swore they had heard his voice in the dark. Even constables, hardened by years of service, admitted to unease when patrols took them near the river at night. Holmes received the reports with a sardonic curl of the lip, yet I knew him too well not to perceive the weight they carried upon his mind. "Ghosts, Watson, are the refuge of those unwilling to confront truth," he said. "Yet such tales serve a purpose. They cloak the deeds of living men in the terror of the supernatural, thus disarming the reason of those who should resist them." I could not help but feel the chill of those whispered stories nonetheless. For the memory of Moriarty, like a spectre, still lingered in my own mind. That terrible figure locked in mortal struggle with Holmes upon the cliffs of Switzerland. To imagine him risen once more was madness. And yet, as I gazed upon my friend, absorbed again in his dark studies, I wondered whether this case would force us to face not only the living remnants of a criminal empire, but also the phantoms that haunted Holmes himself since that fateful day in 1893. That evening, long after our client had departed, and the city outside lay swathed in mist, I found Holmes still seated by the fire, his hands steepled, and his gaze fixed upon the dancing flames. The letter and its copies lay spread across the table, yet he had not touched them for some minutes. There was a gravity about him that I had rarely seen, and though I had long grown accustomed to his silences, this one carried a weight that pressed upon me. At length he spoke, not to me at first, but as if to the shadows themselves. There is a thought, Watson, that troubles me more than all else. In 1893, I faced Moriarty at the Reichenbach. I believed then that his network, though vast, was but the extension of his will. Yet what if I was deceived? What if his power endured not only through loyalty, but through treachery? What if one whom I trusted had lent him aid? I started at his words. Never before had I heard Holmes suggest the possibility of betrayal from within. His tone lacked its usual steel. It carried instead a note of somber reflection, even of doubt. He turned to me, his eyes colder than the fog at the window. If that be so, then the hand we now pursue is not merely the continuation of Moriarty's shadow, but the echo of my own failure. That, Watson, is a spectre more dreadful than any ghost. I longed to reassure him, to remind him that his victory had been hard won and his sacrifices great, but I saw that such words would fall hollow. Holmes was engaged in a battle not only against living foes, but against the ghosts of his own conscience. It was in that uneasy silence that my own eye fell once more upon the original envelope. I had handled it often since its arrival, but some small irregularity now caught my attention. Its weight seemed disproportionate to the single sheet it contained, and its fold appeared unusually stiff, as though concealing some hidden reinforcement. Holmes had not stirred. He remained lost in the labyrinth of his reflections. Thus emboldened, I drew the envelope closer and turned it beneath the lamplight. Running my fingers along the seam, I perceived the faintest ridge. A sudden conviction seized me. "Holmes," I ventured, "have you considered that this may contain more than one page?" He glanced up sharply, a flicker of surprise passing across his features. "Examine it, Watson. Your instincts may serve you well." With trembling care, I teased open the corner with my penknife. The paper yielded with a faint crackle, and there, pressed flat against the inside fold, lay a second sheet, long hidden and yellowed with age. My pulse quickened at the sight. Holmes leaned forward, his eyes alight once more with keen interest. "You see, my dear fellow," he said softly, "how even the smallest detail may conceal a revelation. Your diligence has unearthed what all my instruments failed to discern." I withdrew the hidden sheet and laid it upon the table. Its script was hurried, the ink smudged, as though written in great haste. The date at the top struck me with the force of a blow. May 4th, 1893. The very day Holmes had fought for his life at the Reichenbach Falls. Holmes's eyes darkened as he read aloud, his voice steady yet edged with steel. "I write in terror, for I fear the net is closing. If I perish, know that another walks free. The accomplice none suspected. He carries our secrets still, and his vengeance will not rest." The confession broke off abruptly, the pen trailing into a smear of ink, as though the writer had been interrupted at the final stroke. The room seemed to contract about us, the silence pierced only by the hiss of the fire. Holmes laid the page down with deliberate care. His face, though composed, bore an intensity I had rarely witnessed. "Watson," he said gravely, "this is no phantom's trick. This is the voice of the past, preserved by chance, reaching across the years to indict one who escaped the reckoning of 1893. And if this accomplice yet lives, then we stand upon the threshold of a danger greater than any we have faced." As the lamplight flickered upon the faded words, I felt as though we had opened not merely an envelope, but a grave. And the dead had spoken. The confession lay before us, its hurried words seeming to pulse with menace, though written more than a decade earlier. Holmes's eyes remained fixed upon the page, as though he might wrest from it the very soul of its author. At last he spoke, his voice low and deliberate. "Watson, you recall how the downfall of Moriarty's network was heralded as a triumph complete and absolute. Yet here, in the scrawl of one who perished that day, lies the proof of our error. One man, unnamed in the records, slipped away beneath the smoke and ruin. He has carried the embers of that empire with him into the present. I felt the old chill seize me, the dreadful knowledge that our victory had been but partial, that from its ashes a serpent had coiled unseen, waiting for its hour to strike. Holmes rose abruptly and paced the room. Mark well the cunning, Watson. An accomplice never suspected, never arraigned, has concealed himself these many years, his vengeance ripened by time. It is he who places these letters in our hands, who stains the streets of London with blood. We are no longer hunting shadows. We pursue a survivor. He stopped, his figure outlined against the firelight, and I thought I had never seen him wear an expression so grim. The noose we believed drawn tight in 1893 was frayed. Now we must discover whose hand escaped it. Holmes's decision was swift. "There is but one path left to us, Watson," he declared. "If this phantom draws us back to Reichenbach, then to Reichenbach we must go. Only there, upon the scene of my supposed death, may we confront the truth behind this confession." The days that followed were a blur of preparation and travel. We crossed the Channel beneath a heavy sky, traversed the wintry stretches of France, and at last reached the dark shoulders of the Alps. As the peaks rose higher, the air grew colder, sharper, as though nature herself resisted our intrusion into her haunted fastness. I confess my heart was heavy. The very mention of Switzerland recalled to me the bleak months I had endured believing Holmes lost forever. His body dashed upon the rocks below those fateful falls. To return now seemed a cruel trial of memory, and yet I followed him willingly, for where Holmes led, I was bound in loyalty to go. Holmes himself betrayed little outward feeling. He studied the confession and his own old notes during the journey, his lips tightening only when the name of Moriarty appeared. Yet once, as the train climbed into the high valleys, I caught him gazing through the window, his eyes fixed upon the mist-shrouded mountains. His voice, when it came, was little more than a murmur. "The past, Watson, is a foe we may outwit, but never banish. Let us hope we are equal to it when it rises again before us." At length, we stood once more before the Reichenbach. The moon hung pale above the peaks, casting long shadows across the ravine. The roar of the waters filled the night with its terrible music, just as it had all those years before when Holmes had vanished from my sight in mortal combat with the professor. I cannot put into words the weight that fell upon me. The spray leapt high into the air, glistening like ghostly veils, while the abyss below yawned black and endless. I seemed to see again that dreadful struggle, Holmes and Moriarty locked together upon the brink, and felt the same anguish that had torn my heart when I believed him lost to eternity. Holmes stood beside me, his gaze fixed upon the foaming torrent. His face was pale, yet there was no tremor in his bearing. "It was here, Watson," he said quietly, "that the greatest mind of crime sought to drag me into the abyss. It was here, too, that I first learned how deep a man's shadow may fall upon the world." The wind carried the spray about us, cold as death, and I shuddered. The place seemed alive with echoes, as though the rocks themselves remembered that struggle. It was no mere landscape, it was a tomb, a witness, and a warning. And in that moment, I felt certain that the past had not relinquished us. We had returned to the Reichenbach not as pilgrims, but as men marked by fate, summoned once again into its dreadful grasp. The Reichenbach thundered beside us, its spray rising like spectral hands in the moonlight, when Holmes, with that swift instinct of his, halted. He raised one finger, bidding me still my breath. A silence fell, heavy and unnatural, broken only by the torrent's roar. Then, without warning, from the black fissures of the ravine, two figures sprang, their movements calculated, their approach precise. I scarce had time to cry out before Holmes thrust me aside and met the first assailant with the force of a man long prepared. A cudgel whistled past my ear and struck the stone with a crack like pistol fire. The second shadow lunged at Holmes, and in the brief flash of steel I saw the knife aimed for his heart. Holmes twisted with uncanny agility, his cloak swirling about him, and the blade met only air, His cry rang sharp above the cataract. "They knew we would come here, Watson. The trap was laid years ago." We fought amidst the spray and shifting stones, our adversaries silent save for the grunts of exertion. It was no common ambush. Every move bespoke careful study of Holmes himself, as though the men had rehearsed their assault against his very shadow. At last, a shot rang out, my revolver, fired more by instinct than aim, and one of the figures stumbled into the spray, vanishing with a cry swallowed by the roar of the falls. The other, sensing his doom, turned and fled into the darkness of the ravine, leaving behind the stench of danger and the certainty that we had only glimpsed the hand directing these shadows. When the tumult ceased, I found Holmes standing perilously close to the brink, his breath quick, yet his eyes alight with grim fire. The mist clung to his hair and garments, making him appear more wraith than man, and for a terrible instant I feared that history had repeated itself, that once again the Reichenbach had claimed him. "Holmes!" I cried, seizing his arm, dragging him back from the edge. He gave a faint smile, as one returning from a distant place. "My dear Watson," he said quietly, "how narrow is the line between survival and oblivion? Tonight, it has been measured by inches." I could not restrain the tremor in my voice. "To lose you here, at the very place I once believed you perished, it would be more than I could bear." Holmes placed his hand briefly upon my shoulder, a gesture rare in its warmth. "Courage, Watson. We live because we observed. The placement of stones, the echo of steps, these betrayed them to me. It is observation, not chance, that preserves us." Yet even as he spoke, I felt the weight of dread pressing upon me. Our enemy had not only anticipated our coming, but had sought to reenact the very scene of Holmes's supposed death. It was no mere attempt at murder, it was theatre designed to wound both body and spirit. As we gathered ourselves from the fray, Holmes's keen eye fell upon something glinting in the damp earth near the path. He stooped swiftly and retrieved it, a small silver locket, its chain broken in the struggle. With deft fingers he opened it, and the moonlight revealed 2 miniature portraits within. On one side, the features of the murdered woman's brother, pale and earnest, the same face we had seen in her trembling description. On the other, the cold, hawk-like visage of a man I recognized from the archives, Wilhelm Krauss, lieutenant to Professor Moriarty, a man believed slain in the sweep of 1893. Holmes's expression hardened as he closed the locket with a snap. "Here lies our proof, Watson. The dead brother was no victim of random cruelty. He sought to sever his family's ties to the old network, and for that he was silenced. And Krauss, alive, or at least remembered by those who continue his work, binds the crimes of the past to the murders of today." The locket seemed to burn in his hand, a relic heavy with unburied secrets. He slipped it into his pocket with deliberate care. The chain that was thought broken has only lain hidden. Its links stretch from the Moriarty of old to the shadows that now walk beside us. And mark me well, Watson, the hand that dropped this trinket will strike again. I gazed once more upon the roaring abyss, its spray rising white against the night sky, and felt as though the falls themselves whispered of vengeance unfinished. The ghosts of 1893 had not merely returned, they had never left. Holmes sat rigid in his chair, the locket recovered at Reichenbach lying upon the table beside him. Our visitor, pale, trembling, yet resolute, faced him across the hearth. For a moment, the silence pressed upon us like a physical weight. Then Holmes spoke, his voice cutting through the gloom like a blade. "Madam, you came to us as a victim, pleading for justice. Yet what you concealed was the stain of complicity. Your family was not merely touched by Moriarty's shadow, it was nourished by it. Wealth flowed into your household through channels of fraud and extortion, profits made in silence, masked by outward respectability. You lived upon the spoils of his empire, even as others perished beneath it." The woman gave a cry, half gasp, half protest, yet Holmes's gaze did not falter. When the professor fell, he continued, his lieutenants scattered like rats from a sinking ship. Some were captured, some killed, but others sought refuge among his allies, and your father's house was such a refuge. The letters you carried were not relics of grief, but the very documents by which those ties were preserved. Her hands trembled upon her lap, and in the flickering light I thought her pale face a mask already cracking. For myself, I felt a chill of horror. That the woman who had come to us as a supplicant should be revealed as the descendant of criminals, bound to the professor's dark legacy, was a revelation almost too dreadful to bear. Holmes rose and paced, his long shadow falling across the firelit room. But here, Watson, lies the pivot of the case. The brother. Unlike his sister, he recoiled from the taint of their inheritance. He saw at last that silence was complicity. He gathered what evidence he could of the old crimes and prepared to bring it to the light of day. And for that act of defiance, for that rebellion against his family's unholy allegiance, he was silenced with ruthless finality. The woman's lips moved, but no words emerged. I could see in her eyes the truth of Holmes's accusation, though pride forbade confession. Yes, Holmes pressed on, your brother's murder was no random cruelty. It was justice of a kind, meted out by those who still clung to the professor's cause. They made of his death a warning, and they chose to place beside his body a letter bearing my name. Why? To summon me, to draw me back into the coil of 1893, to reopen wounds thought long healed. I confess the thought struck me like a blow, that a man had died not merely for his own courage, but as bait to lure Holmes back into danger, filled me with a righteous anger that threatened to choke me. I turned toward our visitor, but Holmes's hand restrained me. His gaze was fixed, unwavering, upon her face. The woman rose suddenly, her composure at last broken. You think yourself omniscient, Mr. Holmes, she cried, her voice trembling between defiance and despair. But you cannot fathom what it means to watch one's family ruined by your so-called justice. We lived in fear and want, scorned by neighbours, abandoned by friends, because you tore down the man who fed us. Do you call that justice? Holmes regarded her coldly. I call it consequence. You mistake punishment for persecution. It was not I who sowed those seeds, but Moriarty, and those who bent knee to him. Her eyes flashed with sudden fire, and in that moment the mask of frailty fell away. I saw her not as the helpless petitioner she had feigned, but as a woman hardened by bitterness, sharpened by years of hidden rage. Holmes advanced a step, his voice like iron. It was you, madam, who placed the letter at your brother's side. You who devised the charade, weaving old papers into a snare meant to bind me to your cause. You are not the mourner, but the architect. You sought to make of me a pawn in your vengeance against the past. The silence that followed was terrible. At last she laughed, a low, bitter sound that chilled the very marrow in my bones. And why should I not? It was you who began it, Holmes. With Moriarty's fall, you destroyed not only the master, but all who lived beneath his shadow. You left us to ruin. I have only repaid the debt. Holmes's eyes never wavered. No debt justifies murder, and no mask, however pale, can hide the hand that writes in the ink of blood. I felt the air itself grow heavy with her unmasking. The case had turned, the victim revealed as the villain, the supplicant as the deceiver, and yet, as I looked upon her face, I could not deny the tragic fire that burned within her. A woman forged into villainy by the sins of her house and the ruins of 1893. For a long moment, the woman stood silent, her pale face drawn in the firelight. Then, with sudden vehemence, her composure broke. You speak of justice, Mr. Holmes, she cried, her voice rising with each word. But you know nothing of its cost. My family was not guilty of crimes, only of surviving them. Yes, my father dealt with those who served the professor, but what choice had he? To refuse him was to invite ruin. And when you struck Moriarty down, it was not the criminals who paid, but us. You destroyed our protection. You dragged our name through filth and left us beggars. You call yourself the champion of the innocent, but in truth, you destroyed lives that never lifted a hand against you. I felt the words burn, for though they were twisted with bitterness, they bore a kernel of painful truth. How many times had I seen the shadow of Holmes's victories fall upon those who, though not wholly innocent, had not wielded the knife themselves? But Holmes remained unmoved. His gaze fixed her like a specimen beneath the lens. "Madam," he said coldly, "you mistake consequence for injustice. The fortunes your family enjoyed were stolen from the toil of others. That house of cards fell not by my hand, but by its own corruption. If you have chosen vengeance for your loss, then you have embraced the very poison you claim to abhor." Her eyes blazed with fury, but I thought I saw too the glimmer of tears. "Then know this, Holmes. It was not Moriarty who destroyed us. It was you. His fall was your triumph, but our ruin. For that, I would see you haunted forever by 1893. Holmes let the silence linger, then drew from his pocket the bundle of letters she had brought to us at Baker Street. One by one, he spread them across the table, his movements deliberate, his voice calm as steel. "You place these in my hands as if they were relics of the past. In truth, they are your own handiwork, the snare by which you hope to entangle me. Observe." He bent close to the nearest sheet, tracing the faded lines with a slender finger. "Note the faint indentations along the margin. These are not marks of age, but of your own pen, where your hand pressed too firmly. Here too, beneath the ink, lies the repetition of a pattern, a cipher, hidden in the very strokes of your letters, identical to that discovered in the envelope. And in every one, the hand trembles not with time, but with design." She gave a cry of protest, but Holmes pressed on, relentless. "Even the ribbon that bound them is of recent weave. You wove the past and present together with cunning, but left behind the fibres of your deception. You believed yourself the puppeteer, drawing me into a theatre of ghosts. But the hand that wrote these words is yours, and yours alone." The woman staggered, her strength faltering beneath the weight of his proof. For myself, I felt both awe and dread. Awe at Holmes's brilliance in unravelling the final knot, dread at the cold inevitability of the net that now closed upon her. At that moment, there came a knock upon the door, and Inspector Lestrade entered with 2 constables. Holmes's message had been dispatched earlier, in expectation of this hour. The woman stiffened, her face pale as marble, but her eyes flashed with a defiant fire. Lestrade advanced, brusque but respectful. "You'll come with us, madam. The charge is murder, and the evidence is plain." For an instant, she seemed as if she might collapse. Then, gathering herself with a dignity born of rage, she turned upon Holmes with a voice that rang like a curse. "You may bind me, you may parade me before the courts, but you cannot silence the year that made us what we are. Remember it, Holmes, 1893. It will never leave you, not in your sleep, not in your triumphs. The ghosts of that year will walk beside you until your own end." The words struck me with a chill deeper than any winter wind. She allowed herself to be led away, her pale figure vanishing into the fog beyond our door, yet her vow seemed to linger in the air, heavy and inescapable. Holmes stood silent, his eyes upon the fire. For a moment, I thought I saw in them a glimmer of something almost like weariness, the burden of battles that could never truly be ended. At last he spoke, his tone quiet, almost reflective. "She is right, Watson. The dead never wholly release us. Every victory leaves its shadow, and for me, that shadow will forever be the year 1893. I said nothing, for I knew in my heart that her words were true. 1893 was not merely a year past, but a phantom that haunted the present, and perhaps always would. Our return to Baker Street was marked not by triumph, but by silence. The fog that pressed against the windows seemed heavier than ever, as though it sought to stifle the very air we breathed. Mrs. Hudson, seeing the weariness in our faces, refrained from questions and withdrew quietly, leaving us alone with our thoughts. The familiar sitting room, with its worn chairs and lingering scent of tobacco smoke, had never felt so changed. The fire crackled in the grate, but its warmth could not dispel the weight that had settled upon us since Reichenbach. It was as though the ghosts of that place had followed us across sea and land, and now sat unbidden within those four walls. Holmes, silent and gaunt, lowered himself into his chair. He did not reach for his violin, nor his pipe, but stared long into the flames as though searching for meaning in their restless dance. I took my accustomed place opposite him, but found no words to bridge the gulf between us. In that silence, I found my thoughts returning again and again to the abyss of Switzerland, to the moment when Holmes had stood upon the brink, the spray of the falls about him, and I had feared that fate had at last claimed him. The memory was so vivid that even now I felt my heart tighten at its recollection. How fragile, I thought, are the triumphs we count as victories. Moriarty was gone, yet his shadow endured, reaching across the years to strike once more. The woman had been unmasked, her vengeance exposed, yet her words lingered like poison, that 1893 would never release us. And I, who had walked beside Holmes through many trials, could not deny the truth of it. The line between survival and ruin had narrowed almost to nothing. That he still sat across from me seemed a miracle, and yet I knew the battle had scarred him. The cases we had shared were not merely puzzles solved and set aside. They had left their mark upon us both, and perhaps none more deeply than this. At length, Holmes stirred. His voice, when it came, was low, almost meditative, yet it carried a chill that silenced my breath. The dead never rest, Watson. They leave their mark upon the living. We deceive ourselves if we think otherwise. Each crime we unearth is but the echo of older sins, each enemy but the heir of some darker legacy. We defeat men, but never the shadows that cling to them. He leaned back, his face pale in the firelight, and the words seemed not only an observation, but a confession. In that moment, I glimpsed the burden he bore, not merely the pursuit of justice, but the knowledge that every victory carried its ghosts. Holmes reached for the letter, the first relic of this dreadful affair, and laid it upon the desk. He studied it with a gaze both sharp and uneasy. "Observe, Watson," he said. "Each day since it came into my possession, the ink has grown fainter. It is as though the hand that wrote it cannot bear to remain in the present, as if time itself seeks to erase the confession." I bent closer, and indeed the script, once bold, now seemed paler, the strokes dissolving as though into mist. The sight filled me with a sense of dread I could not rationally explain. For all Holmes's brilliance, here was a mystery that mocked reason, a message that resisted being read, as though the past itself fought to remain concealed. Holmes replaced it in its envelope with unusual care, his fingers lingering, as if reluctant to release it. That night, as the fire burned low and the silence deepened, I found my thoughts circling a single, inescapable question. We had faced villains of cunning, of cruelty, of vengeance, yet none had shaken me as deeply as this. A case not only of murder, but of time's relentless hold upon us. Holmes sat across from me still, but his face seemed distant, shadowed by battles none but he could fully understand. The woman's curse echoed in my ears. 1893 will never leave you, Mr. Holmes. And I wondered, with a shiver, if it had not bound us both. Perhaps, I thought, the greatest mystery is not Moriarty, nor the accomplice who escaped justice, nor even the pale visitor who sought her revenge. Perhaps the true enigma is time itself, that unseen hand which preserves, distorts, and erases, yet never releases us from its grasp. And with that thought, I closed my diary for the night, though I knew its pages could never wholly contain the shadows of 1893. Holmes leaned back in his chair, the dim glow of the fire casting long shadows across the room. His gaze lingered on the fading letter, then turned to me with that grave composure I had come to know so well. "Watson," he said quietly, "the past is never wholly silent. Men imagine they bury it with the dead, yet it whispers still, in ink, in memory, in vengeance. To ignore its voice is folly, for sooner or later it will demand to be heard." And so, dear listener, I leave you with a question. What do you think was the pale woman's greatest miscalculation? Her faith in deception, or her belief that the ghosts of 1893 could truly be controlled? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this mystery, share it with friends, subscribe for more Sherlock Holmes adventures, and join us again as we unravel the shadows that never rest.